This week, I speak with Alex Zelden, a columnist at The Forward. Recently, Zelden tweeted about the positions in President Biden's administration that are likely to be filled by Jews, and, well, there are a lot of them, which scares a lot of us. Is it safe for so many Jews to work for Biden? Is it safe to even talk about that? I'm Lev Gringaus, and welcome to The Jews Are Tired, your podcast about Jewish news. So the main idea of this podcast episode and this conversation with Alex Zelden is the anxiety many Jews feel about being so represented among the powerful, in this case, in the new president's administration. So before I keep talking, to give a little more context to our conversation, here's what Zelden tweeted on January 19th that prompted this whole thing. Quote, "Tracking Biden's Jewish senior staff so you don't have to. Chief of Staff, Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Director of National Intelligence, Homeland Security, Attorney General, Council of Economic Advisors, Deputy Directors, State CIA, NSA, Assistant Secretary of Health and Human Services," end quote. It should be noted that some of these positions have been filled by the Jews presumed to fill them. For example, Janet Yellen has been confirmed as Secretary of the Treasury. Others have not yet been filled as of the writing of this intro, like the Attorney General job, for which Merrick Garland is Biden's nominee. But really the bigger point here is this is kind of an innocent tweet. There are no hot takes, there's no opinion whatsoever. It's just a list of positions and you don't even have names. There's no, here's Goldberg, none of that. And yet it elicited responses from many Jews on Twitter who wrote stuff like, quote, "On the one hand, this is super cool, but on the other, it may only increase violence against us," end quote. And that's a widely held Jewish anxiety. We want to be proud of members of our tribe who are achieving great things, but those people, by virtue of being Jewish, are also always representing us. And if they fail, that's a public embarrassment or worse for the American Jewish community. Particularly in a moment of rising anti-Semitism, that's a tough pill to swallow. So many Jews being so prominent in the current political moment is unsettling. But does that mean we should be afraid to talk about this, even if the anti-Semites see us doing so? And that question is a huge part of why I asked Zelden to come on the podcast. He pushed back on Twitter against the anxiety-ridden Jews, and I wanted to know why, and to get his insights on navigating this Jewish tightrope of emotions informed by generations of persecution and trauma. Our actual conversation ended up being this and more. We talked about the nature of Twitter as a platform for these sorts of Jewish conversations, and I could not resist, seeing as Zelden is a fellow Russian-speaking Jew, asking him about that background on both a serious and a silly level. So let's get to it. This conversation has been lightly edited for clarity and content. Enjoy. So first of all, just as a recap, tell us what responses you saw to your tweet about Biden's Jewish senior staff. Were there any ones that particularly stood out to you? Any sort of themes? Like, what did you see?
I'm going to be a little bit difficult here and first say that Twitter is an imperfect medium, and I think a lot of people will do two things with it, right? They will both say that Twitter is not real life and then be incredibly emotionally invested in the things that happen in there, right? And I think you have to reconcile these two ideas. And the way that I do is to say that this is the start of a conversation. Nobody's complete thoughts are in it, right? Like the way you and I are talking, I think will capture a lot more of the nuance and complexity of this than what was happening on Twitter. But to recap very quickly, I, as somebody who's very interested in American foreign policy and very interested to see the directions that the Biden administration goes in it, I've been paying attention to the folks who are expected to be appointed to top positions. Now, we can put that with a bit of an asterisk there of most of these positions require Senate confirmation. And just because a name has been floated out is not necessarily what the final result of it is going to be when things shake out. There are partisan reasons, there are nonpartisan reasons for why somebody may not get a Senate confirmation. there's, to my mind, no administration that has had a perfect record of everybody who they put up on first try getting through. So we'll start from there of saying the names that I know are people that have been floated for everything. That's not necessarily how it's going to shake out. Now, with that caveat aside, I got very excited looking through this list because it's a lot of people who, they're all very qualified people. A lot of them have served in the agencies in senior roles before in previous administrations, whether it's been the Obama administration or others. And B, that, from the perspective of, and I think it's one that you share for Russian Jews, of like, this is really something that's unimaginable from where we come from, of seeing that at the highest ranks of national security, of diplomacy, of things related to foreign aid, everything through intelligence, of where we come from, we were treated as a security liability, that we have dual loyalties, that we are inherently suspect, and to have it come through where these folks are being rolled out as the nominees for these roles, and they're not even talking about the fact that they're Jewish, because nobody in America besides Jews and Nazis cares about it. That's just really what it boils down to. And that's something that's very unique to this country. And, there's a degree of ethnic chauvinism, I will own it, of just being very proud of like, look, my tribe gets to serve its nation at the highest levels, and people want them there. That, is very enjoyable. When I posted this on Twitter, I kind of fired it off without really thinking about what the response would be, or the fact that like a lot of journalists follow me on Twitter. So when I fired it off, and, I don't have Twitter on my phone anymore. I did it from my laptop. I closed the laptop and I went about my day. And I came back to just an enormous amount of replies, both from, everyday Jews who follow me on Twitter, but like media folks as well. It eventually made its way through Farsi Twitter, through Arabic Twitter. There's some Russian language things in it as well. And of course, Nazis found it as well. So, it spanned the whole gamut of it. And I think like a lot of the replies were very interesting. We can go into like the details of it, but the big basic buckets were a lot of Jews who were both proud, but also feeling a lot of anxiety of, this is a lot of Jews in top roles. If they fail, if they, do something bad, then that reflects poorly on us. And I think that, if you have like a bit of a tribal mentality, and a lot of Jews do, that there is something to that feeling of, we are all responsible for one another, and that can come out positively or negatively. Of positively, we're very proud when Jews do good things, and negatively of, when a Jew is like, on trial for something because they did very bad things, like there's a collective kind of shame that comes out of it, of, with, what's his name? Bernie Madoff, for example, who hoodwinked a lot of people. Like, a lot of his clients were actually Jewish nonprofits. So Jews were materially negatively impacted by his actions. But the public response from a lot of Jews was this behavior of like, oh my God, this guy lived up to all the stereotypes of, these greedy, manipulative, and lying Jews. And that's shame on all of us. And why I end up pushing back on that in particular is because I think that there is something that Jews have internalized that is not our beliefs on things, but somebody else's beliefs on what is a suitable public role for Jews to be having. And for my mind, it is every role that anybody else is eligible for. I will not put any kind of qualifications on it. Like, if you ask a lot of Jews, should a Jew be president of the United States? They will say very plainly, no. If you really press down on what that means, it's an internalized belief of Jews should not have power. That's not our idea. That's somebody else's.
Okay, you bring up a lot of points that I know we're going to come back to and sort of bounce around the rest of the conversation. But I also, just to touch on sort of the initial reaction, because as you were explaining that, of course, it doesn't come across in a podcast with audio only, but you visually looked like you were surprised when you opened up your computer again and saw, oh my God, everyone's freaking out about this. Like, maybe sort of a weird question. Why were you surprised?
I think because, I don't really take Twitter that seriously. Like, this is a very funny thing of like, I will encounter folks, in a pre-COVID world, I would come to like a wedding or something, and somebody would come up to me like, oh my God, I follow you on Twitter. Like, I love your stuff so much. And to me, that's like a horrifying thing of, Twitter is not where I'm doing my real work. Twitter is where I'm goofing off. right? And, in the best case scenarios, I'm promoting my actual writing on Twitter, and I'm making connections with other folks in the industry through it. Like that's the positive purpose, but most of the time it's just shit posting. And the fact that like there are very serious, thoughtful people that I respect, people who come out in the real world and are expecting to learn from me from my Twitter account, I just find it a little bit disturbing of this is not the place for it. If you want to read what I actually think about things, go read my columns.
Interesting. I do want to press on that a little bit more because this is almost a commentary on Twitter culture itself. And as being one of your followers, you do post a lot of really in-depth, fascinating, well thought out commentary. So it's kind of interesting to hear you think about it as like either sort of making connections and advertising yourself or just shit posting. But like there's a spot in between that so many of us follow you for, and it's interesting to hear you sort of try and get away from that. It's like,
yeah, you're gonna get me in trouble with my editors because I always get the feedback of like, you should write this as a column. I'm like, I would love to, but to do this thoroughly would require more research. And, I'm working on this other thing first. You have to prioritize, right?
Right. But it's like John Oliver saying he's not a journalist when they do so much real journalism on that show. So like, how do you look at the Twitterverse as you're putting this stuff out there?
I would say like in both situations of like comedians in late night who are doing real journalism, but don't want to be held accountable the way that journalists are. And for me, of like, it really boils down to like, I don't want my tweets held against me, right? If I'm being very honest about it, that to be very frank, like a lot of the times it's not all thought out. And I try to do my best to use the platform less. That's like part of why I haven't removed it from my phone of like, it's very time consuming and not a good use of my time. And B, because things are half baked, I don't want people to hold it against me. Because, if I'm really pressed to it or if I have to do some more research, I might change my mind on it. And, it's just like a snapshot in time kind of thing and should be treated that way. I think where the distinction comes into play is very often when we're talking about like Twitter culture, like there are people on there who are trying to advocate for particular kinds of ideas, who are trying to change minds. And, you can have a real exchange of ideas on the platform, and it's something that I really like, but I don't do that as much as I used to. Let's put it that way.
Interesting. And I should also note, I mean, part of the reason why I'm interested in asking you about that is because it was just yesterday now a New York Times editor was fired for posting a tweet that she felt chills when Biden landed in D.C. for the inauguration. That's like part of the whole Twitterverse drama right now is blowing up over that.
Yeah, I'm proud to say I'm disconnected enough from Twitter that I was not aware of that. She was fired over a tweet?
Yeah, that's the story.
Who was it?
I don't remember her name.
Okay, I'll check it out. But yeah, like that's that's a double-edged sword here, especially for people in the media world, and this well, of, you're supposed to be on this platform because, it promotes your work, it gets you connections in the industry, it helps you gain notoriety for X, Y, and Z. But it is such a double-edged sword because, like, again, we all have half-baked tweets that we just fire off, and it can end your career. It's a really horrifying kind of thing. I hope they reconsider. I don't think that she should be fired over a tweet, which is a line I've consistently said.
I would agree with you. So then to come back to the tweet and sort of holding all of that, the nature of Twitterverse, your initial response to everybody freaking out about your tweet about Jews in the Biden administration, you then tweeted out, quote, "Read the replies here if you want to see how centuries of anti-Semitic violence has made Jews internalize fearing any member of the tribe wielding any semblance of power." So I'm wondering, again, what made you decide to dig in your heels and revisit that point? Because what you're pointing out is a real and deeply rooted anxiety, but it's also stressful to even talk about it. Because the moment you're talking about Jews in power, you're talking about Jews in power on Twitter, a public platform, anybody can see it. So, what made you go, nah, you're all uncomfortable, but this is important enough that I'm going to talk about it anyway?
I think to my mind, I will take a step back from it and explain how I got to this kind of conclusion. Like, I'll preface this with, I'm very much in the minority. I know most Jews do not want to be talking about this publicly. I know a lot of people are having a lot of anxiety about the fact that there are expected to be a lot of Jews in senior, very public roles in the Biden administration during what is an exceptionally stressful period in our country's history, and one where, right-wingers are looking for any excuse to demonize this administration, and we've seen far-right violence being channeled towards Jews and other minorities during this time. So you have that very much in the background here of there's a constant vigilance that is unfortunately necessary when you're a minority in America and when you're a Jew in America or anywhere else, unfortunately. The way that I got to this frame of mind is, I think I was raised in a particular kind of mindset, and Lev, I think this will be familiar to you, of, you know, in a kind of Soviet sense of you're not supposed to draw attention to yourself. Attention is just uniformly bad, especially when the attention you're drawing is because you are a Jew, right? Like for my parents, what that meant in the Soviet Union was my mother being singled out on the first day of class and kids beating her after class because her teacher singled her out as a Jew. For my father, when he was in the Red Army, similarly subjected to violence because he was singled out as a Jew. You end up internalizing this kind of mindset of being identified as Jewish equals violence all the time. And in their context, that the survival skills you have in place is don't draw attention to yourself, keep your head down, don't give them any excuse to beat you, because there's also no recourse through this kind of system as well. The whole game is rigged against you. They have taken that mindset with them to a place where the rules of the game are a little bit different, right? And I think that beyond Soviet Jews specifically, you know, other Jewish communities have also been subjected to violence because they are Jews and brought that mindset with them to America. And it has sustained itself over generations, right? This idea that there is something inherently bad about being publicly Jewish. And I think that argument has a lot of power to it, but I also think that there's a big difference between accepting how people will be treating you and accepting those rules for yourself, that this is an acceptable way to go through life. I have a lot of vigilance when I go into a kosher supermarket and I worry of, well, people have attacked kosher supermarkets, even within the New York area. Last year, we had a shooting at a kosher supermarket in Jersey City, right across the river from me. In Paris, it was the same kind of thing. In identifiable Jewish institutions, we had a bunch of bomb threats. There was a shooting at a synagogue. Pre-COVID, I would come in and ask myself when I would go into services of, is this going to be the day? I'm not totally foreign to that mindset, but there's a big difference between me thinking this is a real risk out there in the world and me thinking this is acceptable and I should be hiding from these people. No, I will still wear my kippah. I will still go to that kosher supermarket. I will still go to the synagogue because the way I do it is normal and their violent reactions are the abnormality here. And we should always treat it that way. And it comes back to the same kind of thinking of like, well, what does it mean for Jews to be in positions of power in America? Of, well, what does it mean for a white Catholic to be in a position of power in America? Why aren't we asking that question of Joe Biden, right? This is a question that probably a lot of minorities wrestle with all the time. But like, you know, if you're a white guy in the majority, you're fine. And, you know, Jews, particularly ones who look like me and you know, juggle back and forth between enjoying that majority privilege of you're judged as an individual and the minority one of, well, if you do something bad, it's because you're a dirty Jew.
So just to sort of boil that down again, all of that was like ringing in your head as you saw the replies to your tweet and you decided to keep pressing back on that.
Yeah, I think that it's not just this tweet or this particular instance of it. Like I think, struggle with it in a lot of different kinds of spaces. And what it fundamentally boils down to is there's something abnormal about Jews. There's something different about Jews. And maybe like we humor ourselves with this in like the positive ways of like, look at all of our great accomplishments and everything. But there is something toxic to the mindset that we are inherently different from everybody else and should be judged differently than everybody else. So I'm very proud about these folks getting these jobs because it signals, you know, the acceptance that we enjoy in this society. But if they mess up in those jobs, I'm going to criticize them for it. Not because they're Jews, but because they are public officials representing my government to the world.
So I guess to ask the question a little bit differently, does any part of you have any sort of regrets about addressing this stuff on Twitter and in the Twitterverse instead of like, do you prefer that you would have looked at the replies to your initial tweet gone to your editor at the Forward and said, okay, I'm going to write a full thing about this so that when I reply to it, people actually have to read a long form piece and understand the full nuance of it outside of 280 characters. What was how do you approach that part of it? Do you regret tweeting, I guess?
I do not regret tweeting. I stand by the ideas. I also this is like a thing that breaks a lot of writers' brains of when they get ratioed on Twitter. It just like radicalizes them in very, strange ways of, I don't really care if people disagree with me. I put it out there because it's something that came to my mind. If I change my mind on it, I'll let you know that I changed my mind. But the fact that I'm getting ratioed for it doesn't mean a thing to me. And I will never try to organize my writing about, people who are mean to me on Twitter. It's the most demented thing that writers do.
So then I want to ask you on a particular kind of, because when I was reading through the comments, a lot of, particularly from Jews, you got a lot of this attitude of, why are you making a list of prominent Jews? The Nazis are going to see it.
It's a very wholesome idea when you think about it. The Nazis wouldn't be aware of the fact that there are Jews in government and don't make lists unless Jews make it for them. It's an adorable naivety to it, right?
Right, but that's then the anxiety that so many of us have and the voice that so many of us have in our heads of don't talk about Jews too much because the anti-Semites will notice. And again, I saw you replying to individual tweets pushing back on that. So I want to sort of get you directly on what don't you buy about that argument? I feel like you've walked around it a couple of times before in our conversation, but I want to try and press right on that. And again, given the context of, this is a question I feel like comes up a lot in Jewish journalism and Jewish writing, the sense of why are you writing bad stuff about the Jewish community or publicly airing our laundry when that could reflect badly on us? And again, the Nazis will see it. So why were you pushing back?
So you asked two questions there. I'll take them in order. On the first one of why I was pushing back is because the notion here of you can't do this because the Nazis will see it is a ridiculous one on its face. Of Nazis love to keep lists of Jews. And I'm sorry for anybody who's an older listener is perhaps not as internet native, but if you spend enough time on, the sleazy corners of the internet, you learn that Nazis have a lot of free time and they're doing this whether I'm tweeting about it or not. That's just the nature of the world. That's the world that we live in. And so you have to ask yourself the question of, well, should I structure my behavior? Should I structure my beliefs around how people who want me dead think about it? Or should I do it in the ways that I actually believe? I will do it by my own rules, and I'm not going to stop doing something for fear that it might, provoke a Nazi. Nazis don't need provocation. They look for any excuse to go after us. That's just who they are. So, I'm not going to organize my behavior that way. The other part of it is, and this leads to the earlier part of it of what should be normal and acceptable. What should be normal and acceptable is the way that I am talking about it. What should be unacceptable is the way that Nazis do it. It's fundamentally wrong. Look how terrible it is that there are Jews in this government. We're American citizens. We have every right to pursue public service as everyone else. Indeed, I would call it a duty for us to be doing that. Why is it different for us except for the fact that we are Jews? And I'll also caveat that with, these folks also believe this for every other minority. It's internalized in their minds of the only people who deserve to have power are white Christian men. I don't believe that. And if you believe in an America that represents all of its people should be reflected in its government too. And hopefully we will see other minority groups represented as well in this government. But the starting point for me as a Jew is I fundamentally think that this is normal and fine. And I think it's great that it didn't even factor into Biden's assessment of who does he want in these roles. The second one here of how should Jewish media be navigating this? I've watched this for a lot longer than I've been involved with it myself, right? I think that there's always a hard point of should we be talking about this? The example that always comes up of hypothetically, a ship sinks in the ocean and we have the registry of who is on board, and a Jewish publication prints the names of the Jews who happen to be on board. Well, why are we singling out that it's Jewish? And I think that the simple answer to that is because no one else will. And Jews do want to know that information. Were my family, were my friends, was my community impacted by this? Of course, we mourn everybody who is lost in this kind of event. But I also want to know specifically for my own tribe, because it might be somebody I know. We are a small world. The Jewish geography game is a thing that exists for a reason. We can pretty much connect each other through about two Jews anywhere in the world. There's just not that many of us. And so, like, obviously we have a high interest in this. That Nazis also have an interest in this is just something that's beyond our control. You know, anti-Semitism exists in places where there are no Jews. Anti-Semitism exists in places where Jews are doing all the right things. The idea that, you know, we have some control over how these people who hate us will behave is an illusion. And I don't think that we should buy into that or structure it in our personal behavior or in Jewish media that way.
It feels like you've given guideposts on how Jews should be approaching that anxiety of there's a lot of Jews in the Biden administration and prominent Jews. And it feels like the mindset you've been sort of laying out is we should just kind of, you know, to use blunt language, we should kind of just suck it up. I mean, this is not just suck it up in a bad way, but like recognize this is a great thing in America that Jews can be in such prominent roles, and it's not so scrutinized like it is in other contexts. But, you know, even given that, I'm wondering if you have any other answers to the question of how you think Jews should be approaching that anxiety.
I can't tell anybody else what to do. I can tell you how I approach that anxiety, right? And I think I even tweeted this after the fact of, you know, it's not one that I have just, you know, I consider this normal, so I'm fine and going about my day. Like we're Jews, we're always going to have anxiety. That's just the way it is. How I reconcile this kind of information is that the standards that I hold our community to are intracommunal standards, and they're very different from how Jews should be treated in a public light. And it's important to draw a bright red line there and remember when you're assessing these people, are you assessing them as members of the tribe or are you assessing them as members of the American public? If Bernie Madoff misbehaves, I'm assessing him as both from a tribal perspective and also from a public perspective of like, this guy really shouldn't have ever been in the position to do this. There's regulatory failures that happened here, right? But it's also from the perspective of, you know, as a Jew, it brings me shame that a member of my own tribe did this and, you know, gave ammunition to the people who hate us most. That is the kind of line you always have to walk. And with this administration, the way I approach it is like, hey, most of these people, I don't mean to cast aspersions on anybody, but only one of them to me is somebody who is quote unquote actively involved in the Jewish community. And what I mean by that is like a regular shul goer, a member of an observant community, that kind of thing. The rest of these folks, I think, are actually fairly representative of American Jews as a whole, in that, you know, as far as I know, they're not that active in Jewish communal settings. They're just folks who happen to be Jewish. And it's important to remember that when assessing how they're doing in this administration of, are you assessing them on the communal grounds or as public figures? I'm proud of them on communal grounds, but again, I will still hold them to the same standards that I will hold any other public figure to, because they are charged with governing in our country, of protecting our country, of enacting a good and wise foreign policy. And if they don't live up to it, they should be criticized exactly the same way that anybody else who's in those roles would be criticized. And so that's how I do it, of ask yourself what's the motivation here behind how you're assessing these folks in this moment, and be honest with yourself about what it is.
So to kind of tie a lot of those pieces together that we've been mentioning during this conversation, if you're okay with it, I want to ask you on a more personal level, because you mentioned before about coming from the Russian Jewish, Soviet Jewish background. But what about you? I mean, did you specifically have a moment in your life where you had to sort of realize, okay, maybe I am okay wearing a Star of David necklace in public. Maybe I am okay with setting aside some of the fear that I've inherited. Like, what did you have sort of a journey of getting there? Or is this sort of an American thing that because you grew up in America, you're more willing to be expressive about your Judaism than your parents necessarily are?
This is going to be a whole other podcast. So I think part of it is, I can't neatly delineate between the two. They're very much intertwined. For me, growing up in the States, I grew up, with my parents in a Russian-speaking home. Most of their friend group was other Russian-speaking Jews, and most of their children were too. So, yes, we were in America, but I wasn't speaking English fluently until like the third or the fourth grade. I was taking ESL for multiple years. The mindset that we were raised in was very much still a Soviet one in many ways. We would go, our groceries were not the normal supermarket ones. We would go to the international stores for Russian and Soviet cuisine. The cartoons that I was raised on were not the American classics, of which I have like a major blind spot, but cartoons from the 60s and 70s of the Soviet Union. So there's still very much a Soviet Jewish kind of mindset and sensibility that comes into all of this. But that kind of stuff, when you leave your parents' home, I think is when you start asking those questions of like, well, what does this mean now that I have to take ownership of it? Right? Like, it's not just like my parents and my community are doing this and I'm just a passive recipient of it, but I now own this. What does it mean to be a Jew here? And the way that I wrestled with that question was, well, I don't have a fifth line to my passport here. My teachers have never singled me out as a Jew on the first day of school. That's an experience I have never had in the United States, right? If I went into the army, I'm sure that there are some anti-Semites there, but it wouldn't be taken as a given that I would be bleeding and hospitalized on my first day in the army. That's just not the norm here. And that's not to say that there isn't any anti-Semitism here. We've seen it in New York. We've seen a tremendous rise in anti-Semitic violence. We all saw what happened in Pittsburgh and in Poway. And we all know, interpersonally, Jews have experienced anti-Semitism in their lives in one form or another. It's just a different kind than it was in the Soviet Union. And it means that the kind of identity that you develop here is necessarily going to be different. How I answered that in my own life was, well, what does it mean to be a Jew? Is it sufficient to just be born a Jew and call yourself a Jew in a context where, nobody's forcing you to do this? You have an out if you want to. And for me, that led me towards the religion. And when you're in the setting of you are studying Jewish text, you are adopting a kosher home, you are adopting, the Jewish calendar of Shabbat and the Chagim and everything else, of, well, why do I have to hide any of this? Why do I have to be ashamed of this thing that brings me great meaning in my life? When anti-Semitic violence started making its way to Israeli news, I would have my babushka calling me up, and she would beg me not to wear my kippah in public. And my response to that was, if I wanted to hide being Jewish, my parents would have left me in Belarus. We didn't come here to hide. We came here to be who we are. And for me, that means the religion. It means not hiding the fact that I am a Jew. It's something to be proud of, and it's something that is just as normal as any other religion. And granted, like, again, this all comes with the caveat of, like, it's not just Jews who are wrestling with these questions. There are other communities, most notably Muslims in America too, who are really wrestling with what does it mean to be accepted here. And I think that it's a lot more challenging for them than it is for us in many ways. But that, in the context of my own personal journey here of, I'm not going to hide doing this. And if I have to hide doing it here, then I don't want to live here.
Thank you for being willing to get so personal. So the last question I have is very silly, but I can't let you go without asking it. And I apologize to the listeners who may not know Soviet cartoons very well, but what is your favorite Soviet cartoon? Because also I have to ask, because you mentioned the blind spot of American cartoons, and I have such trouble explaining that I really don't know American cartoons to my friends. It was fascinating to hear you say that out loud. So what's your favorite Soviet cartoon?
I feel like the correct answer has to be Cheburashka. But for me, Kabelson was like my favorite of. It was just like such a whimsical kind of cartoon. It was this story, I think it's based on like a Swedish book. I might be getting those details wrong, don't quote me on that. But basically it's a story of like, there's this little boy in Moscow who, the opening of the show is he's so lonely, he just wants a friend, and he asks his mom for a puppy. And the mom says no, and he's just like, Mama, у тебя есть papa, Mom, you have dad, and to his siblings, you have each other, and me, I have nobody. And from that kind of setting of like, hey, there's like a cultural shift here of like, Russians are more comfortable expressing, shall we say, the spectrum of negative emotions than Americans are. There's like a constant pressure to like be happy and go lucky here. in a way that is just not the case from a Soviet background. And B, that setting shifts into he befriends this weird little old guy who has a motor attached to his butt where he flies around in the sky and convinces this kid to go on adventures with him to go get jam. And it's just like so whimsical and weird and different, and I adore it so much.
Amazing. And for the listeners, a motor attached to a propeller, so it's literally like a propeller man.
Yeah, sorry. He has a fan on his butt and he flies.
So amazing. Thank you so much, Alex, for taking time out of your day to be on this podcast.
My pleasure.
This has been this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast. I'm Lev Gringaus. Don't forget to subscribe and share, and hopefully next week, the Jews will get some rest. The Jews Are Tired is a product of Jewfolk Inc. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com or email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com.